So, there's just so much. There's just so much. I'm finding it really challenging to be a learner. Like, I know I talk about it a lot, I preach about it a lot. Here's all of this energy that I think it's so important for us to be a learner. And what I mean by being a learner isn't that everybody has to know all of the different pieces of Torah and the Talmud and Jewish law, like, hey, that's cool, that's great. I make a living at it, I'm into it. But I mean really just being open to the process of being a learner, of being open-minded, of hearing another perspective. And there are times, truly, that I would rather wrap myself in this big blanket of myth without needing to be confronted by any new kinds of truths, any of those truths that I was never told. That I can just kind of stay in a cocoon and I don't have to worry about it. But that's not really a reality. Not if we want to continue to grow. And there have been a few things that have been rocking my world these last number of days. One of them is this story of Thanksgiving, my family's favorite holiday, and learning in recent weeks as well that some of our most key leaders of Reform Judaism, rabbis, professors, scholars, teachers who have led the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, symbolic exemplars of liberal rabbis, were actually, I can't believe I'm saying this, we're actually engaged in predatory and harassing behaviors toward women, individuals who were LGBTQ plus identifying, people of color, and others. A report came out in these last few weeks, released by the Hebrew Union College itself, for all to see, to my seminary's credit, for all to see, made public, and with calls for teshuvah, with calls for repentance and restoration. And I haven't been able to shake it. Thanksgiving I've been trying to deal with for a long time, but it's hit me harder this year. So how do I manage things that I love and have appreciation for and have given me gifts? And how do I stand on a bima to say how wonderful these things are without sharing some other kinds of light? We are a people, especially at this season, especially this coming week, who talk about the power of light. So we need to share some light. So let's start a little bit with Thanksgiving. Our childhood remembrances of Indians and pilgrims coming together for a shared meal, but in James Baker's book called Thanksgiving, the biography of an American holiday, we learn that the first mention of a Thanksgiving occurs in 1637 after colonists massacre an entire village of Native Americans, the Pico village, and celebrate that victory. President Washington wants to start a Thanksgiving holiday with no relation to those early colonists or any relationship to Indians. But remember, too, that our celebrated Declaration of Independence, lifting up words that all men are created equal, a few lines later refer to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This is how our founders viewed the indigenous peoples of this land, as merciless Indian savages. And I have to say, it's not really any different than what Pharaoh said about our people, our ancestors in the beginning books of Exodus. According to Baker's book on Thanksgiving, the sanitized version of the story emerges with new immigrants coming into this country in the late 19th and 20th centuries. And those who had power wanted to define Americanism, So Thanksgiving became what Sean Sherman, who's the CEO of Sous Chef, he says, a fabricated, peaceful description between the colonizers and the tribes, and neglected to mention the amount of death, destruction, and land grabbing that occurs against the first peoples, setting the tone for the next 200 years. Sherman, Native American himself, a well-regarded chef who talks about bringing indigenous ingredients back into Thanksgiving as his effort to reclaim a part of a story of gratitude. Sherman teaches us that a myth was advanced to show how wonderful America was to these new immigrants and what it meant to be a real American. Let's put that in one pocket, one bucket over here. If I go to this other one that I mentioned, I learned in seminary, rabbinical school, from some of the same teachers as Rabbi Deborah Bronstein, our Rabbi Emerita, Catherine Schwartz, our Director of Lifelong Learning, previous rabbis who served this congregation, and some, not all, but some of our leading institutional figures have actually committed crimes of harassment and assault. Others have created unwelcoming learning environments, and still others remain silent. Folks who knew what was going on in a seminary, in our seminary. One of those named rabbis in the report, Alfred Gottschalk, in his obituary, is celebrated for his courage to ordain Sally Priesand, Rabbi Sally Priesand, the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi in the United States of America. He was celebrated as an act of courage and valor, and we learned that he was an aggressor on our campuses to women students. Yes, I said his name. Whether it is about our wider country or our sacred communities, how do we respond to myths that hide the truths that we were taught to hold dear, that were supposed to bring us some level of comfort and security, purpose and meaning? How do we balance this all? I don't think it's enough to cut and run. I don't think that's the right answer. So I'm going to share another one. It's going to start with Maimonides. Maimonides, one of our greatest medieval sages. He wrote in a Sources of Laws called Hilchot Temurah. He says the mitzvot, our sacred laws and commandments, the mitzvot are God's instructions and advice for living and improving our character. And all these matters, which he's referring to as the mitzvot, all of these matters are to help us to overcome our negative inclinations and to correct our traits. Most laws of the Torah are instructions from afar, from the great advisor. I like that term for God, the great advisor, to help us to correct our character traits and straighten our ways. So for Maimonides, one of our greatest of teachers, the mitzvot, these laws, aren't just about keeping order. It wasn't just for us to be following. It wasn't just so that we have a commander and that we are the commanded. It was so that we can learn something, so that we can be reflective. In more modern times, a founder of modern orthodoxy in Germany, not a great proponent of Reform Judaism, by the way. His name is Samson Raphael Hirsch, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And Rabbi Hirsch wrote a treatise of philosophy, of Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought called Horeb. Horeb is a synonym for Mount Sinai, so revelation is coming at Horeb. And in this book, Horeb, he taught that the word lehitpalel, which means generally to pray, lehitpalel, it also forms the word tefillah, which is a prayer. Lehit palel and tefillah has the same root letters. He says originally it was meant to deliver an opinion about oneself. Lehit palel is a reflexive verb. So it's not just to pray, it's really, according to Hirsch, to judge oneself, to reflect upon ourselves. He says it denotes to step out of active life in order to attempt to gain a true judgment about oneself, about one's relationship to God and one's relationship to the world, and the world to oneself. In English, we call tefillah prayer, but this word only incompletely expresses the concept lehitpalel, to pray. In other words, to ask for something is only a minor piece of what prayer does for us. Asking for something is a small piece. Praise is a small piece. The fundamental function of our tefillah is lehitpalel, to actually engage in reflection, discernment. Think about where we are, where I am in this world. It's not just to praise. It's to examine. It's to judge. It's to figure out what we consider the truths that need to be present in our world. And it's in this vein that I want to share another teaching. I've been thinking a lot, reading a lot from a teacher named Peter Block. And Peter Block has a book called Community, the Structure of Belonging. And in this book, he explains what he considers to be a restorative community. Restorative community, he says, is activated by language of connection and relatedness and belonging, spoken without embarrassment. It recognizes that taking responsibility for one's own part in creating the present situation is the critical act of courage and engagement, which is the axis around which the future rotates. The essence of restorative community building is not economic prosperity or the political discourse or the capacity of leadership. It is citizens' willingness to own up to their contribution or agency in the current conditions, to be humble, to choose accountability, and to have faith in their own capacity to make authentic promises to create the alternative future. For me, that's one of the best paragraphs ever. And I know it's a hard one to hear. I can share it afterwards if you're that interested. But the idea of humbling ourselves. Usually we hold people accountable only to punish, but it's really more than that. It means that I have ownership over something important, and I want to explore the possibility of a better future together with somebody else. If I was to take his words and put it into religious terms, I would talk about it as tikkun, as healing, as repairing, as restoration, to bring wholeness, little by little, to build wholeness. How can we bring healing to different kinds of traumatic experiences in our country, in our community? And I think we do that. We answer that by speaking honestly, by learning truths, even some truths that we might not be so sure of, by learning more honestly about who Native Americans and indigenous peoples are, by advancing a brave space where we can raise questions and be supported in asking our real questions, gain clarity, journey with greater empathy, and using our power, our influence for the betterment of all. There's just a few ways that we can do that tonight together. I appreciate that you're here listening, if you're awake. And I've never done this before, but I think it's time. I think one small way is to acknowledge that the land where we gather and pray today in Boulder County is within the territory of the Arapaho people. And we can honor Chief Left Hand, the leader of the last Arapaho band to spend their winters in the Boulder Valley. Many people were massacred by the U.S. Cavalry at Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864. The survivors were forced out of Colorado to reservations in Wyoming and Oklahoma, where most Arapaho live today. We recognize that the synagogue sits upon land within the territories of the Ute and Arapaho peoples. Further, to acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. In our daily lives, let us honor and respect that the Boulder Valley is home to so many people and to other tribes that also lived out their lives here for centuries. Native people of many indigenous nations live here today. And back to that other bucket, to respond to that report from the Hebrew Union College, the way to respond is also to acknowledge truths that some of these scholars their actions make me want to throw up. And we have to hold people accountable. And it doesn't represent an entire institution. And we respond by strengthening our efforts here in building our own plans to advance safety and respect and equity in our congregational community. And we've been working on this past year. We have an SRE task force. We put up information on our website. We talked about a breach, a covenant of behavior, of how we hold each other accountable, how we call people in so that this can be a place of restoration, of tikkun, and to build a true community of belonging. I'm thankful this Shabbat and this week for many things. But just like the Native American tribes of this that are inhabiting this country, who have been inhabiting this land for all of these centuries, as they have been teaching that gratitude isn't about one day, it's true in Jewish prayer and ideas and thought too. It can't be reserved to this time in November. If we can only make gratitude contagious, if we can learn to be open, like the wilderness, like the desert that they received the Torah in out in Sinai, if we can break some of those boundaries and containers that restrict what we think is true to what we learned in 4th grade, can we continue to grow and challenge and engage in those acts of tikkun? I hope we can. 586, friends. We move to conclude the bottom of paragraph. On 586, we invite you to rise.